for coming. And I want to welcome you to a fabulous evening with Dr. Julie Seeley, who's going to be telling her family legacy story about the Skinny House. And so we want to welcome the family members and the community members and friends. We apologize for the slight delay, but we had to get Julie a working microphone, so we're all set now. But anyway, my name is Gail Boyle, and I'm one of the co-presidents of the Mamaroneck Historical Society. And this evening, along with the Village of Mamaroneck and the Mamaroneck Arts Council, we are sponsoring this evening of information about the Skinny House, which, as you know, is one of our historical murals, or the theme of one of our historical murals being put up in the village right now. So thank you for joining us for this event. There are plenty more events tomorrow. I have cards on the side if you want information on events tomorrow. And of course, the grand opening of all of the murals, including the Skinny House, is on. Very exciting if you can make it. I also have, of course, the Mamaroneck Historical Society membership form for those of you who are just not members yet and are pleased to have this kind of presentation be a part of your community experience. So please join us. And Dr. Seeley.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate you coming out tonight after work. It's a wonderful evening. A little bit better weather than yesterday, warmer today. First, I'd like to thank the Mamaroneck Historical Society and the Mamaroneck Arts Council, and of course, my family. This is my extended family. Please stand up and say hey. I'm going to ask Yvonne to say a few words a little bit later on in the presentation. And the reason I introduced them is that I got to know them through writing the book. Well, my father grew up in Mamaroneck, and my grandparents lived here for many, many years. There was a larger Seeley family. There were Seeley brothers and Seeley sisters. They weren't very close with each other, and so over the years, since I grew up in Baltimore, I didn't know the extended Seeley family. So I just wanted to say how wonderful it is to write a book, to do some research, and meet new people, meet new family members. Can you hear me? A little bit louder? Okay, great. So the reason I love this story is because every time I give a talk about and share the story of this Skinny House, I learn more about Mamaroneck, I learn more about my family, and I also learn more lessons about what this house has taught me. I know that over the past 2 or 3 decades, the house has been known as the Skinny House or the Thin House. And there's been a lot of mystery about the house. There have been a little short summary of the house being donated by Mr. Santangelo to my father. And I wanted, after many, many years, to share the story of my family. What we wanted to know about Nathan T. Seeley, my grandfather. So my grandfather, Nathan T. Seeley, built the Skinny House. My father, Nathan Seeley, who we'll call Tom tonight, grew up in the Skinny House. He was an adolescent when he moved in the house in about 1932. And I wanted to share his perspective as opposed to my grandfather's perspective of the house, and also of my son's perspective, the millennials. And so this is a wonderful story because it's a generational story. It's a universal story. It's a story of about an American family who survived the Great Depression, who went on to have education as the forefront of a family, and had not my family, my father proceeded to Lincoln University in Chester County in Pennsylvania, I would not have gone on to college and become a physician. So the message of the story, one of many, many messages, is what our parents did does count, and how I wanted to understand how it influences generation after generation. Who would have known that my grandfather's accomplishments spawned a company? Okay? SkinnyHouse.org is my company, and my motto is sharing legacies one story at a time, because I'm assured that in this room there are legacies in boxes in the basement, and that's exactly where I found mine. Okay, so let's start. This is the Skinny House. It's a family legacy. This is the skinny house. It was built in 1932, and this is how I remember it as a kid. There were lace curtains or floral curtains in the door window. There were grape arbors on the walkway. I always had to squish some green grapes on the sidewalk. And it took my grandmother about 5 or 6 minutes to get to the door to open it to greet us. I did not live in the skinny house except for about a summer when I was a toddler, and you'll see some pictures about that later. But I grew up visiting my grandmother in the house season after season, and really know every nook and cranny of the house. It's a very dear house to me. What I like about the house is that it is a 10-foot wide house, 3-story, single-family home that was built by an African-American carpenter who taught himself how to build and who went to some night classes to learn drafting. And as you know, the story goes that it was a house built out of necessity. That part is true. But what I wanted to share with you is what I stumbled upon learning about my grandfather. I did not meet him. He died when I was 7 years old. And my father and he were estranged for many reasons, none of which I understood about at the time. But as it goes in many generations, father and sons sometimes are estranged. I wanted to know more about my father. My father, Tom Seeley, graduated from Mamaroneck High School in 1938. He absolutely was a shy, introverted young man who was always reading and had very few friends, but he loved music. And the one thing I didn't know about my father is that when we were growing up, if he met somebody who was from Mamaroneck, he got a little nervous. He started to sweat a little bit. Was kind of afraid that they would know that he grew up in the skinny house. So I will tell you that my father inherited some shame about growing up in this odd-looking, strange-looking home. He was 10 years old when he moved into the home, and he really had some traumatic experiences for him to form those opinions about the home. So I wanted to understand more about that because he didn't talk about the house, he didn't talk about his family, but my mother did tell us about it. And so I wanted to learn a little bit more. Since a kid, I have been fascinated with Mamaroneck. There's something about the name that is really transpires a wonderful feeling. I know that many of you have heard this loose translation, the place where the sweet waters fall into the sea. To me, it's very, very descriptive. It means that it's a place of transition, a place where different cultures come together, a place where there's a sense of community, flowing, changing. And to me, that's what Mamaroneck means. So while I live in Northern Virginia now, my heart will always be in Mamaroneck because I know my father had a good life here. My grandfather was a very, man who gave a lot to the community, and I think he really, really flourished in Mamaroneck. Well, I told you it's 10 feet wide, but this is the side view. To me, it looks like a stack of Legos. As you can tell, there's mismatched windows, and you could see it's actually 3 floors. It's hard to see there. There's a cellar as well. And you can't see very well in this picture. I may have something next. My grandfather thought the house would sway in a big storm. So he put double steel cables on each side of the house, anchored them to the building, and anchored them to the earth as well. So my father said that he could feel it sway a little bit in storms, but actually it's a very upstanding member of your community, I would say. I actually added this picture today. This is actually the steel cable, one of the steel cables that is connected to the building. And it acts as an anchor, as you can see. Heavy duty, and they are still quite strong. Here are my happy memories. This is my Aunt Shug. She is really the one I know that had the most fun living in the skinny house. Aunt Shug was a beautiful woman. She wanted to be an opera star. And basically, she also went to Mamaroneck High School, and she and my father were very close. But she had a different outlook. Well, my father was introverted and shy and really had trouble handling the transition of family life during the Depression. My Aunt Shug loved to sing. She loved music, and she found comfort in music. And I really think that made a difference on how she handled trouble in life and how she handled significant events. And I think that's how we feel about our kids. One child may handle an event this way, another one will handle it a little bit differently. And my father and my aunt were very, very different. That's my brother Michael and myself. And you can actually see there's heavy-duty furniture there, oak furniture there, that could not come in the front door. So my grandfather built around the furniture to place it in the living room. You'll also see behind my Aunt Shug, there's a white panel behind the heavy-duty chair. And that panel was built into the living room wall so that it would have an opening on the outside, and the postman would put the mail inside the box. And my grandmother would reach out and get the mail. So she didn't have to exit the building to get her mail. And that was one of the innovative features that my grandfather did. He also, you can't see it now, but there's a panel up above that chair, not too far, and there's a drop-down door where my father called it his library. He learned to smoke up in there. I don't know why the house is still standing, but he did learn to smoke up there. And it was a library. There was a stack of books, and one of the books was labeled How to Overcome Shyness. So there were 3 books that he saved. One was Moby Dick, one was How to Overcome Shyness, and the 3rd book was How to Be Happy in a Marriage. So I don't know if that was my grandfather's book, the 3rd one. But those were happy memories, and we would come visit my grandmother, who fed us coffee, ice cream, and always had candy in her pockets. It was a happy experience. Very, very, very happy.
How old were you there?
I think about 4, my brother about 3, something like that. But generally, he always got me in trouble. Absolutely, always got me in trouble. Now, I was smiling, and my Aunt Shug was smiling. And so I decided to write this book to share it with my son, who's now 29 next week. And when he was in 3rd grade, I had an assignment to go to the school and tell a little bit about a grandparent. So I said, wow, this is a great story. I can tell them about the skinny house. And so I had to go down in my basement, in the back, in the dark, and open some dusty boxes. And there I found the blueprint of the skinny house. And I was thrilled. I said, oh, I can take this to the school and show these 3rd graders, and they would say, wow, isn't that a wonderful house? But digging in that box in the basement, I found some other very, very interesting things. I found lots of pictures about my father, and the one thing I noticed, can you tell which person is my father? The one who looks very happy. Yes, and I realized that, that looks familiar, because a lot of the pictures, my dad's not smiling. So this is Mamaroneck High School yearbook, 1941, no, 37. He was a junior. And at that time, I think the family was having some issues in terms of finances. They were in the skinny house for the past 4 years, and there were strains on the marriage and on the family. And I think a year after that picture was taken, my grandfather moved out of the house. And so my father felt the trauma and the strain of that family falling apart and that family being fractured. So I started to understand how a young person can view trauma in the family, and I had to have some compassion for my father, who was going through a lot. So I was trying to understand why that look stayed on his face for many pictures. So I was digging in this box and I found this blueprint, but then I stumbled on a very odd looking pamphlet. And the pamphlet was a pamphlet that my grandfather had put together to advertise his building business. I said, what building business? I had no idea. And so the reason that I was able to show you this is because my Aunt Shug, my father's sister, was meticulous about saving everything. She labeled every picture, she labeled every person in the picture, and she saved the only copy of the pamphlet of the Seeley Brothers building. And so finding this pamphlet blew me away. You mean to tell me I had an entrepreneurial grandfather who had a building business and who incorporated the business in 1925 and was talking about building homes for African Americans migrating from the Deep South to the North to escape racism. I had not a clue. And so I want you to, I'm just going to read the first couple of paragraphs because they are striking. And it was really, it took my breath away. The title of the pamphlet is called Homes for Colored People, and this is the colored man's home. Every colored man needs a home. That statement does not require proof. It is the dearest wish of every individual of every color or race to have a clean, decent place in which to house his family, in which to bring up his children in peace and comfort. But there has been a great increase in recent years in the colored population of the North. This has brought with it a very serious housing problem. No longer is it easy for the colored man to find, at the price he can afford to pay, a decent place in which to live. That's incredible. That's 1923, and the business was incorporated in 1925. And he goes on, nor can he look to the white man for assistance. That individual has his own troubles. He is too busy making a living for his own family to worry about the difficulties of any other race. The colored people must work out their own problems. They must help each other. It is for that great purpose that Seeley Business Brothers was incorporated, to supply colored people everywhere with homes. I was blown away. Now, some of the language is dated, but the sentiment that you can be proactive, you can be self-taught, that you can find resources that you can build to help your community is brilliant. And you can satisfy a need for the population. So I just was blown away that I did not know much about my grandfather, and I decided it would be important for me to write about that. But I didn't. It took years. So I put it back in, this information back in the box, and back in the basement it went. And it wasn't until I actually took a screenwriting course about 10 years ago, saying, well, it might be interesting to learn how to do a screenwriting course. And I took it in Westchester, Pennsylvania. Somehow I love Westchester. And a 21-year-old director student taught the class. And I wrote a paragraph about the skinny house. And he wrote, like, what? You need to write about this. And I knew that there was passion brewing in me about this topic, but I also knew I didn't know what I would find. So from that time on, I thought it would be important to me to write about it. And I will tell you, are there any self-published authors in the audience or people working on writing a book? You know that it's tough. For me, I did it little by little. There were many weekends that it was emotional to learn about a history that I didn't know about in my own family. But I got through it. There were days that the words flowed, and there were days that I had to string sentences together. But I was really convinced that it's important to do a lot of research if I were going to get the facts straight. So I do the best I can with this book to give you the facts so that you can enjoy the story just enough history so that you can enjoy the context of events and you can understand why people made their decisions that they did. I also realized that the story of the skinny house, yes, it's about brick and mortar. It's about an unusual house, but it's more about people. And it's about the characters in my life. And so on the right here is my grandfather, Nathan. This was taken when he was about 17 years old. He was a confident man, I would say. He understood and learned conversational Italian. He did that. He was ambidextrous, always showed it off. He was able to use both hands. And he always dressed in, that's unusual because in his adult life he always dressed in overalls, something which my grandmother was not thrilled about. And he always usually had a pencil tucked behind his ear because he was always making lists. So in the boxes of memorabilia I found lists. List of building supplies, list of things to do, list of people to pay. So he really was an organized man. However, he went to 9th grade, and I think back then there was a different way of learning, and we're going to talk about that later. Now, he married my grandmother, Lillian, and she was, her father was a Pullman porter, and this picture was taken in 1926 when my grandfather built the house next door to the skinny house for her. So he custom built a regular size house for my grandmother. I have the specifications, and he was very specific about, you know, what degree the temperature and the boiler should be, how the door handles knob should be cut glass, the workmanship should be top notch. There shouldn't be too many knots in the wood used for the house. And he dedicated to the specifications for the house built for Lillian Seeley. So my grandfather really wanted his wife to know that she was going into be part of the middle class. You can see this is the 1920s because she's hiding a cigarette in her hand. She has her hands on her hip, and she's in front of her brand new house. She's a very, very proud woman, and she was able to stay home and raise her kids while the Seeley Brothers business was doing well. This is my Aunt Shug, and as I told you, she wanted to be an opera star. So she sang and sang and sang. And she was able to be tutored by Mademoiselle Paté. And this is a famous opera teacher who had immigrated to the US. And I had to do research on her as well. And I found out that her father, Charles Paté, was one of the founding fathers of French cinematography. And how did I know that? Online, there was an auction of boxes of her family travel photos from around the world. And you might know there's a portrait of her in the background, and that was painted by a very famous painter. I can't remember at the time. So my aunt and Mademoiselle Paté forged a great friendship, and she actually mentored her for her first recital. And the good thing that you should know about my aunt is that she wrote her own press releases, and she just absolutely loved to sing. And this photograph of my father is one that he did at age 15. He looked at himself and is a self-portrait of the mirror. And I think he was really keen on giving this self-portrait to my grandfather. It's labeled 1935, would have been about 3 years that he moved into the skinny house. And I think it was a gift. But I'm so happy that that picture survived. It kind of really says the essence of who my father was: pensive, shy, and introverted. And this is the Santangelo family. They have been kind neighbors to my family for many, 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 many years. And I wanted to have an earlier picture of them when they were younger, but this is all I have right now. I think Nancy Santangelo would have been here today. As you know, the Santangelo family owns the Skinny House now. They've been good stewards of the house for many decades. And these are that's Panfilo Santangelo and his wife Maria. And they work closely with the Seeley family. I actually found documents to say that my grandfather hired Albert Santangelo, who was a mason. So as you know, there were immigrants that came into Mamaroneck, and they had wonderful skills. And so my grandfather, as a builder, really employed a lot of the Santangelo family. I've thrown this picture in here so that you can see this is the cellar of the Skinny House. Now, you may know that the Skinny House was built on a quarry. And so there was a huge boulder in the cellar. So my grandfather decided to build around it. And it is still there. And, you know, I mean, at this point, I don't think anybody wants to move it after many years, but it is, I call it my Rock of Gibraltar. And you may see the back of Miss Ida Santangelo there. I wanted to know what inspired my grandfather to have a building business in 1920-something. And what I found out was that the Crisis magazine, which was the flagship magazine for the NAACP, talked about residential discrimination in the Midwest. And so my grandfather would read these articles, and his brother Willard Seeley as well, and they knew that there would be a housing crisis that they could help, you know, in Mamaroneck. So the Crisis magazine, I feel, is very instrumental in spreading the news about what was going on in America and really helped forge the need for my grandfather's company. The other thing that the Crisis magazine did, in the back of the Crisis magazine, there were tons and tons of ads for historically black colleges. And so my father and many young men at that time got interested in many of the colleges. So my father did eventually go to Lincoln University in Chester County. One other thing that you should know is my father was a graduate of Mamaroneck High School. He was also on the National Honor Society. However, he didn't have enough credits to get into a college. So he had to figure out a way how to learn geometry. And so he was interested in Popular Mechanics magazine, which is still around today. And in the back of Popular Mechanics magazine, there are correspondence courses on everything then. How to be an electrician, how to learn geometry, how to learn calculus. And basically he sent away for a course in Popular Mechanics and learned how to do geometry, and he was able to pass the entrance exam to Lincoln University in Chester County. So he's being proactive, basically. And actually, you know, I have that on the table here, so if you want to, I did bring some memorabilia here that you can take a look at. So I wanted to know more about Lincoln University, but I also wanted to know why there was a rift growing between my grandfather and my father. So I realized after looking at documents and some of the things that were written in my memorabilia that my grandfather wanted my father to stay in Mamaroneck and learn how to build houses like him. My grandfather didn't think that there was a need for college, and that, which was very common in the day, father would pass down skills to sons of a trade, and that son would carry on the business. And so my grandfather felt he had been very successful as a business, and he expected my father to stay in Mamaroneck to build houses. But my father was the new generation. He wanted to go to college at all cost for academics' sake. And the reason that he chose Lincoln University is because the famous Thurgood Marshall, Supreme Court Justice, went to Lincoln University in the 1920s. And when Thurgood Marshall went to Lincoln in the 1920s, he helped develop the art of the debate clubs in college. And so Lincoln University became very, very famous with their debate team. And my father and a lot of young men in his age group wanted to be like the Supreme Court justice. And they wanted to be able to debate against racism and to debate the issues of the day. So Lincoln had this Delta Rho Forensic Society. And he's still looking pretty serious in that picture there. But as you can see, Lincoln was pretty formal dress. And I actually will just read a little bit about what the rabble culture, not rabble rousers, I guess that's kind of different. But the concept of rabble at Lincoln still stands today, but is very, very significant. It was extraordinarily important to understand the peculiar culture of Lincoln University. And it really was public social interaction, often on display before others in the dorms. One person would initiate a kind of verbal debate, another student or others would pick it up, and the verbal sparring began and continued until someone apparently won the discussion with some powerful closing salvo that he had skillfully, spontaneously, and carefully led up to. Basically, there was a lot of debate on Lincoln's campus, and many of the students wanted to be attorneys, certainly in the civil rights arena as well. Very, very important, and obviously that's why my mother never won a single argument. And this is just really summing it up. The concept of the rabble. I would definitely recommend this book if you want to learn more about Lincoln University. Well, this is where my father did meet my mother on Lincoln's campus. Her brother actually went to Lincoln University, and Lincoln University was really one of the first degree conferring universities in the United States of African Americans. So it was a very, very important university. My mother had her first job as a telephone operator on campus, and she grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, from a large West Indian family. And I really wanted to understand what she went through with the Depression. And by that time, this picture was taken. It was 1944, 45. And there was a war. So my father went to Lincoln University, and by sophomore year, he was drafted and went off to war and returned about 3 or 4 years later. I wanted to understand what her senior year in high school was about, and I found her high school yearbook. I found a wonderful, endearing letter by a counselor who said to the entire senior class, "Your lives are going to change." And in fact, her life changed. There was no senior prom, because there were very few male students in her senior class. And senior year, she would go down to the train station with her girlfriends to see the boys off to war. And she did notice, it was a little strange, that the African American students went in one car in the train, and the non-African American students went in another. And that was very unusual to see in her small world, but she did realize that world was very different outside of New Haven. And that was consistent with the military being segregated at that time. When my parents married and my father returned to Lincoln, he was able to get a job as a professor because all of those returning students were coming back from the war, and they needed a professor of math. He decided that to stay away from an attorney because he needed the money. He had 2 kids at the time, and decided that he was very good at math, and decided that was the best way to make a living. At that time, a lot of the historically black colleges needed accredited professors, and he was easily recruited. I'm going to throw in a picture now of the Skinny House as well. This is the one narrow staircase in the house. As you can see, it looks as if those stairs were measured. My grandmother was in that house until 1986, from 1932 to 86. She never fell. No broken hip, no broken knee, but she was able to navigate those stairs. To me, the Skinny House is a house of lessons, not because it is, you know, small and unique looking, but because it has a big story to tell. And I know that it may be one of the smallest houses in the city here, but it has a lot of good lessons in it. And one of the lessons, I think, is, oops, who will tell your story? Has anyone seen the Broadway play Hamilton? No? Okay. Well, it's a running theme of who will tell your story. And it means essentially that our stories are not complete. They have a lot of holes in it. And I will tell you that one of the things that held me up for a long time is, well, how can I tell the story? I did not meet my grandfather. I just have things in a box. I have some secondhand information from my mother. I'm able to do some research. I understand that. But then I came to realize that sometimes that is what legacy is about. It's not complete, but it's really all we know. And I think that if we put more effort into learning what the dreams and aspirations are of our ancestors, we'll really come to know what legacy is. So I don't have a lot of money that my father left over, but I do have a legacy from my grandfather. I do have a legacy from an aunt who saved all of these memorabilia for me. And I do have the legacy of what the education that my father gave me. So had my father not been able to go to Lincoln University, made the extra effort to teach himself geometry, made the extra effort to stand up to his father and say, no, I'm a different generation. I want to go towards college. I would not have gone the educational route that I have gone as well. And really, this lecture really resonates for college kids, a lot of freshmen, because they come in not really knowing what college is, but when they hear a story like this, I say, okay, like, who is in your family like Nathan? Or who is your Aunt Shug? And that's why it's a universal story, because we always can find someone in our family who can relate to one of these characters. And I tell the college kids that they may come into the auditorium as students, but I do hope that they leave as legacy makers. So I would encourage everybody to look in the boxes in the basement and to see what you can find about your own family. You know, not be afraid to ask questions. For me, I will tell you, I have a few regrets. I do remember cleaning out the Skinny House when my grandmother passed. I was in medical school and I had a little Toyota Tercel. And I clearly remember my mother saying, and do you want those? And there were boxes of dusty workbooks that my grandfather had. And I said no. I said no, I didn't have enough room in my car. I wanted the fancy Depression wear and the floral, nice, pretty looking things. The legacy and the boxes went on the curb or picked up by the trash. I saved a lot. My aunt had, was saving things for years. But I put the legacy in a box in the trash on the curb. So whether this comes later in life, the good thing is that it came enough in time for me to, salvage some of the memories, salvage some of the material, and to put it together in a book. But what I realized is it's okay to start your story with a little bit of what you know. It's okay for your story to have holes in it, but it is your story. And that's why this story is so endearing to me. So I thought this cover was pretty appropriate, meaning that this story is a family heirloom to me. It's precious. It does have a lock and key. Sometimes it has some secrets in it, but it is something that I hold very, very dear to my heart as well. And for the book, I do have some complimentary ones. I would really hope that I get some honest feedback about the book. Feel free to post it online. Feel free to ask for it at your local library. The book is available most places, but I want it to be available at libraries. Yeah, my father loved to read. I think he spent half his life in a chair reading. Sitting in front of a TV, 6 inches were the World Book Encyclopedias. Does anybody remember those? Yes. And Walter Cronkite would come on the TV, and if he didn't know the name of that country or he didn't know anything about the country, he'd reach over and pull it out. He spent the last 15 years of his life reading Russian math journals to see if he could solve some problems. He loved to learn. He absolutely loved to learn. So I am very grateful for that instinct that he had. And I just wanted to let you know that I told you that my grandfather's story has spawned my company, but I've also learned how important it is to preserve these memories. And I've partnered with a preservationist who really can help communities understand how to preserve their history. And this may be a book that you, it's a very important book. It's written by a Mamaroneck author, and Eleanor Phyllis Brackbill. This is a book about how to research the history of a home. And I hope at some point we'll be setting up a panel of that. She has a lot of wonderful information. She was able to research her home here. She now lives in Maine, but this is a wonderful book if you have to kind of figure out how, if you want to know more about the house that you live in. Certainly I want to thank the people here, especially the Yiser family, who was responsible for letting John Pritz know that I was available, and the Santangelo family. And I just want, maybe Yvonne, you can say just a few words about our family and what you think the role is at this point. Just. Thank you.
Well, I'm hoping everyone enjoyed the information that was given. It's like treasure to us. As we stand, thank you, I appreciate that. Being a Sealy, I can remember like in the 3rd grade, one of my teachers asking me, "Are you part of the skinny house?" And I'm like, "What? No, I don't know." "Oh, because we're going on a trip and the last name is Sealy and it's spelled the same way." I said, no, that's not my family. In the 3rd grade, really not knowing. So I go home and I tell my dad, "Are we part of the skinny house or the slim house or something to that effect?" And he says, "Yes." So nonchalant. And I'm like, how do I find this information out? He's like, "Oh, speak to your grandfather." The same as her grandfather was, my grandfather was the same way.
She was Sealy brother.
It's a Sealy brother. So my actually grandfather was part of the youngest. He had a younger brother, Leslie, but he was the eldest. Nathan was the eldest.
Yes, yeah.
So it was, I want to give or take about maybe like 9-10 years difference. So, you know, it was just like, okay, well, how do I find out about this information? How do I know? He said, "Speak to your grandfather." He too was very, very indulged with books and reading and finding out. If you don't know a word, you better believe, go to the encyclopedia, because you had to know these words. So that was me growing up as one of the youngest Sealys. We have Andre Sealy in the house, which he's one of the oldest cousins. I have my wonderful Aunt Yvonne in the house as well. Beautiful cousin Judy, Yolanda, Gary. I mean, it goes on.
Yeah.
So for us, it always come across as, oh my God, we're such a small family. And it took me, I said to my Aunt Yvonne and my cousin Andre, I said, I'm going to find out more about the Sealeys. I know it's more to us than just this. And I started with the Skinny House. And this is how this relationship,
right.
we did not know each other. And this is how this came about. And it's like, oh my God, I can't believe this. The first time we spoke on the phone, we were on the phone for 4 hours. That's incredible. I've never spoken to anyone that long, and we're going back and forth. So, who are you? And tell me. It was like I just wanted more and more, and she doesn't know. She didn't have any idea. When I got off the phone, just tears just rolled down my eyes. I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
So I'm sharing everything with my sisters, and I'm like, oh my God, guess what? This is what happened. So, you know, it was like opening up a treasure chest, and you just don't know what's inside there.
Right.
You know, it's incredible. I always knew the name itself stood for something, but this information is absolutely incredible. When I hear it, when I see the book, when I read the book, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is a part of me. This is my DNA. This is amazing. So, you know, again, I hope everyone enjoyed. And just to let you know, please purchase the book. The book is absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Absolutely
Thank you so
wonderful.
much.
Do you have a question? No?
I think maybe I missed this, or maybe it's in the book, but why did he build the house so skinny? Was it because he didn't have,
Yeah.
as much property as the other people had to build?
Well, read the book, because I think one of the misconceptions is that, no, not the misconception, is just don't know. My grandfather and his brother owned all of the land. And so, yes, he lost his business and he sold part of it. And the part he didn't sell was the 12 by 100 skinny lot. And he had enough salvage materials to build this small house. So it was out of necessity, the size, the materials, the location, out of necessity. But he didn't, I guess, he wanted it to be a classy skinny house, if you know what I mean. So that's exactly what he did. And I will tell you, my grandmother had some issues in terms of adjusting. She lived in the regular sized house next door. And can you imagine the feeling of waking up every day? You had indoor toilets, you had central heating, and now you're going to use Mrs. Brooks' outhouse? That's a big adjustment, certainly for an adolescent. And I think some members of the family adjusted well, and some didn't. But my grandmother, at the end of her life, agreed with Aunt Shug, who said, Daddy did the best he could. Thousands of Americans lost their business. Many families were fractured. Many didn't survive. And it just so happened that my father, I consider a success because he survived a fractured family. He went on to college. My Aunt Shug went on to be an executive secretary at the Pauling School. Okay? I think it's still there. It's pretty. The Pauling's up school in upstate Poughkeepsie. Trinity Pauling, I'm sorry. Right, exactly. So they survived tough times. This is an American family. These experiences are not unique. It's just that we don't know about them. We don't share them. And that is the whole point of writing the book. There are many stories sitting in this room. We just need to find them.
Just a quick question back here. Go ahead, son.
So when you took a screenwriting class,
Yes.
did you write before?
Thank you,
you
Yvonne.
took that class at all?
Absolutely not. That's the other thing that's nice about being out of college and school. They have tons of adult educational classes, especially where I was. I was in the main line in Pennsylvania. They're taught by anybody who has the expertise. And I said, well, what can I learn from a 21-year-old screenwriter? I learned a lot. I worked with him for a year, every 2 weeks on the screenplay. The screenplay was called The Skinny House, and it involved my son. And then I moved on to a different format. So I said, okay, now I'll write the real story, the nonfiction. And so 2020, we'll publish the children's book. And I'm hoping by 21, we'll have the musical.
Two questions. One is structural. What's behind the doors in the front? You
Yes.
have two front doors.
Yeah. Yes.
What's behind the two front?
Yes, yes, yes. And there's a whole chapter on that. So he used railroad ties to support the building, and I wish I would have brought the blueprint, but it's at such a delicate stage that I can't. But it's very secure because about 3 years ago, I hired a preservationist architect who went in and said it was a very strong and sound building, considering this age. It did have some recent termite damage, as you know, but basically the walls are sturdy. There were pillars, cement pillars, railroad ties, quite very.
Where does the left entry enter into? And
Oh,
where's
sure.
the right entry into?
Oh, okay. So this is the entry into that small living room that you saw here, and this is the entry to the cellar. Yes, where the Rock of Gibraltar is. And this is the small living room. You can't see it, but up close there's a ledge for here. But I call them, you know, I feel like as I was growing up, we were the Three Gables. There you go, Three Gables. But, you know, I think he realized, look, I'm losing my house. My wife's unhappy. My family at least we're not going to be homeless. I'm going to make the best. I'm going to make the nicest little skinny house I can. He didn't know that tiny house movement would be in, you know. My father, I wonder what my father would say. He is an adolescent who is ashamed of having grown up in this house. How would he feel now that we say, oh, wow, this is fantastic. Our footprint is reduced, you know, we're using salvage materials. So I really wanted to kind of put in my mind, I have a grandfather who is proud of the house. I have a father who is ashamed. Where's my thought process? And I have a millennial son who thinks his great-grandfather was a genius.
Did your father and grandfather ever reconcile?
They did not. And my father regretted that. I think it was a generational thing in that my father wanted college. My grandfather said, I can teach you a trade. Had it not been for the Depression, we would have done fine. And I think that is an American thing that you see, generational differences. And sometimes they're rectified and sometimes they're not. My grandfather, 2 or 3 years before he passed, moved to New Haven and tried to do the same thing. He he bought some land, surveyed it, and he approached my father again. I'm building a Sealy compound. And my father said, no, thank you. So that's the sad part of it. What's your question? Old people lived in the house? Can you speak? I'm sorry. Old people. Yes, but how old are you? When my father was 10, he moved into that house. And in fact, that was the same year the Sheldrake River flooded. How do I know? There was a picture of my father on a little rowboat in the middle of town, and the title was, oh, kids using the gondolas down the main street. Isn't that amazing? Amazing. Of course, my Aunt Shug saved that picture, and she wrote 1932. Amazing. Thank goodness she was an executive secretary, and thank goodness she saved everything.
What's the menu over on the table with the musicians and others?
I wanted you to understand the role of a historically black college in the 1930s and 40s. Lincoln was premier along with Howard University and others, but mainly because of the history of the leaders that Lincoln University raised and sent out into the world. Everyone went to Lincoln, including Carl Sandburg, Richard Wright, Langston Hughes graduated from Lincoln, the poet. You may have seen online a circulating picture of Albert Einstein visiting Lincoln University. I think the profile of one of those students listening to Einstein as my father. It would have been the same year. My father, Einstein was teaching some physics, but everybody was attracted to this brain trust because all the young men wanted to go. And when they went, let me just read you one thing that's very important to understand the kind of place Lincoln was. Every freshman got a handbook. And one of the things, A Word to the Wise it's called. And I just wanted to say, this is one of the pieces of advice. No one will tell you when to go to bed, when to get up, or when to study. Your own judgment and the seriousness of your purposes must be your guide. There's a true old adage which says, every tub must stand on its own bottom. Apply this to yourself in the careful performance of your tasks, in living up to your highest ideals, in accepting responsibilities for your campus actions. And one of my, this is a good one. This says, listen to this. Remember the folks back home. They're counting on you. Quite likely, they're making real sacrifices for you. Will you let them down? So this was the expectation. These men were serious, young men. You could see how they were dressed. They had formal classes. They had to excel. And they knew that this was one of the brightest opportunities that they would ever get, of being the first in their family, perhaps, to go to college, and what that meant for the future generations. So Lincoln University plays a very, very vital role in my family's life and in my father's life. Again, had he not really tried to get to college, I'm not quite sure we would have done as well. So I hope that everyone has enjoyed the presentation. Some of the memorabilia is here. I guess the main thing to know is that we are all legacy makers, and our first trip down this lane is not going to be perfect. This is my debut writing experience, and it was hard to let it go because I don't feel like it was perfect, and you know how we try to do things perfectly. But when you're defining legacy and you're writing about legacy, nothing is going to be perfect. And I had to let it go. Although it makes you feel vulnerable, it's really important to know where you come from, and mainly to know the aspirations and the dreams and the hopes of our families. That's the most important thing.
Julie, in reading the book, it occurred to me that it was written sort of like an autobiography. I mean, a lot of what your life was is in the book. It's, the premise is the house, but you bring the life to the book. Your childhood, your expectations, your accomplishments, what you saw through generations.
Right.
And could you speak to that?
Well, I think we all as kids, whether we admit it or not, oh, I might be like my father, or I might be like my mother. And I wanted to understand, you know, where my shyness came from, my introvert part of who I am. And I realized that I had a dad who was very comfortable with that. So I think that part of DNA, I think I have inherited. But what I also know is that I do have part of my Aunt Sugar in me too. You know, the perseverance, the endurance, the falling down and getting up. You know, if you have a failed business, you try again. If something doesn't work, you try again. And I'm not sure my father, you know, had that. I also realized that family is important. You know, my father gave up being an attorney because he needed to make money, and he went to mathematics. So I really wanted to understand the aura of my growing up in this family with a father who was like who he was. So while my father, you know, I wanted to understand that. He was always available, and that was very important. Yeah. And I think it's easier to write about myself in the context of a family. And so it flows. You start with history. I can deal with facts because that's okay. And then I add a little bit more personal stuff. Oh, okay. and then you add a little bit more. So I think starting to write about yourself is easy, starting with the history, getting the facts down, the personality. Am I like my grandfather? Absolutely. I think out of the box all the time, don't we?
Yes.
So, yeah. So I'll take some questions, but I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Please, please, if you are going to get the book, as you know, as a self-published author, the marketing part is the uphill battle. So it does count tremendously if you give me an honest review on Amazon, Facebook, but Amazon is the most important. We are canvassing the libraries in Westchester County. The book has been submitted to the New York Public Library. We are approaching the Schomburg. The Smithsonian has already asked for our memorabilia. I'm holding on to it a little bit longer because I want to find the most important home for it. I want to share this. And so this is our legacy. This is our legacy. Our family does not own this skinny house, but this is legacy that I can say we do own. And that was very, very important for me as well, to write it down. For my grandchildren, great-grandchildren, etc., who will tell our story. Thank you all so much.
Outside of the houses that flank the skinny houses, are there any more standing structures of your grandfather and his brother?
Yeah, the house on the other side of the Sant'Angelo, that apartment building, the Sealy brothers built. In the book, I have several pictures of the houses under construction. And so there are more pictures in the book of that as well. The business was booming.
Yes.
It's just like the American business. It was wiped out in the Depression, like that. So who would have known? Who knows what the future would have been for that business had, you know, the Depression not occurred, like many businesses, hard to say. So I hope to...
What makes the Sant'Angelo's the house?
Oh, it's a private ownership. I think they love the house as much as we do, as well. It's a beloved house for two families. Absolutely.
Are you at liberty to say why your family sold the house?
Well, my family, I'm pretty sure the reason that my father sold the house is because of his feelings about the house. That happened in 1986 when my grandmother died, and my Aunt Shug saved the letter I wrote to her with, you know, tears, and I saved the letter she wrote back, and I had to come to, you know, I had to start talking to my dad again because it was a very, 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 very painful thing to lose, but I didn't at the time understand my father's feeling for the house. So that is probably, I must say, sums up maybe the reason that writing this book was so important. I feel like I own it again.
Yeah, even though I am one of the brother's daughters, I'm the next to the youngest. Judy's father is the youngest. My father, Leon Sealy, was the next. But until I read the book, I learned a lot of the information from your book, and I was so grateful. This is the second time I've seen Julie. I've never seen it before. Our family was like so secretive. My father never really said anything about it. Every now and then he would say something, but as a teenager I would just run out the store, you know, and do different things. I was like playing basketball and stuff. I had no time, but my father was a talker, and he wanted to tell me. He told me about her father, Tom, was a mathematician, you know, and I had no time, right? So now I'm wishing that I did to learn.
Right.
I learned a lot from your book.
Thank you.
And I'm so grateful for it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.